Hey, good evening, a good Erev Shabbos. Welcome to all. And again, I hope that anyone who's fasting is still feeling okay at this point in this extraordinarily long fast of Shavuos or Tammuz. In Parsha Pinchas, we are introduced to a fascinating group of women, the Benos Tzalafchad, the daughters of a man who until now was essentially anonymous to us in the Torah. He is mentioned. The family is mentioned in passing in the genealogical records at the beginning of Parshas Pinchas, but essentially we don't know who Tzlavchad is. And his daughters approach Moshe, telling him that our father passed away in the desert, and gives us an intriguing explanation, intriguing description of the circumstances of his death. Torah says, Avinu Meis Bamidbar, our father died in the wilderness. V'lu lo haya b'socha idah hanoadim al Hashem ba'adas Korach. So our father died in the wilderness, and he was not part of the community that had rebelled against God in the assembly of Korach. Ki v'chet meis, he died in his own sin. Okay, those are the circumstances that are described here. And again, the Torah tells us Tzlavcha does not leave any sons behind, right? So based on the understanding of the laws of inheritance, as it had been presented until then, right, the inheritance would continue, would kind of dissipate, go back up the tribal line, right, and that therefore the Benos Tzalafcha, the daughters, would not inherit, and they of course famously pressed their case with Moshe, and God in fact confirms exactly what they said, right? Cain Benos Tzalafcha Dovros, that what they are saying is correct. So the question is, why do they have to mention that they were not part of Adas Korach? They were not part of Korach's congregation. And why is that so relevant to their story? So the Ramban presents an intriguing possibility that perhaps they were concerned, right, that had he been part of Korach's congregation, that Moshe might have, on a personal level, had a greater sense of disfavor towards them. In other words, that it was that particular rebellion, right, that focused really on him, on his credibility and so forth, and that what they were trying to do was preclude the possibility that they might be rejected out of a suspicion that their father had been connected to Adas Korach, right? So therefore they had to go and state this at the outset, right? And again, this is almost it's a little bit startling, in that this suggestion of the Ramban at least assumes that that Moshe would have held what would sound like almost like a personal grudge. In other words, it's not the issue, right, that it was that they were concerned, right, that objectively it would have been worse for them had Korach, had their father been part of Adas Korach, but rather, in other words, it was a different kind of concern, right? It was a concern that Moshe would hold a grudge in that situation. Now, Rashi, and here he's really building on the Midrash in the Sifrei, right, wants to say that we have to consider it in the context of the way they describe his death, right? It says that our father was not part of the congregation of Korach, right, and that therefore that b'chet meis, right, that he died because of his own sin. So the Medrash drills down and says, what does his own sin mean in this context? That his own sin means, yes, in other words, he had his own, kind of private business, right, that led to his death, right, his own reckoning, as it were, with God, but that he should not be seen as someone who is a machtias harabim, who caused the public to sin. Now, there's a very great philosophical difference, right, between the idea of a person who is a sinner, and again, even a sinner themselves, in halacha, we distinguish between different kinds of sinners. Now, there's someone who is a mumar l'teyavon, someone who sins because of their own appetites, right, is looked at more leniently than someone who sins out of an act of rebellion against God, right? And there's a person again that people are struggle with their appetites. Again, it's not that that permits the forbidden, right? But they are viewed and judged differently, right? So the way Rashi wants to say the assertion, right, is it's not even about Korach specifically. It's about the idea that his sin, right, was not in a as part of a rebellion that was supposed to impact on other people, right? He sinned, and therefore, and that's part of their argument, right? That Slavchad should not be viewed, right, as someone who was a rebel of the sort, that his whole claim to inheritance should disappear, right? In other words, really someone who is part of Adas Korach, right, who's part of Korach's congregation, right? His children shouldn't inherit his property in Eretz Yisrael, that by his actions, right, that he is has cut himself out of the community. Right, and that according, again, the difference between Rashi and the Ramban is the Ramban wants to drill down specifically on the Torah only mentions Korach here, right? That he's not part of Korach's rebellion. So what's different about Korach's rebellion than perhaps any other sin? Right? Rashi sees it more globally and says the Korach here is representative of any Korach-like sin. He dies because of an individual sin rather than something else. Now, the phrase now, in other words, the phrase bichet o, right, in his sin, right, would seem to indicate that there is a sin of some sort associated with the death of Tzlavchad. And the question is, what is that sin, right? So the idea of, I'm going to give you a number of different approaches that we find where the sin, right, perhaps includes some kind of merit. So the first is the famous opinion of Rabbi Akiva in the Gemara that he was the Makoshesh Eitzah, right? He was the person, right, who went out and gathered wood on Shabbos, right? Who again we read about a couple of weeks ago, and was judged for was judged to be executed. Now again, it's interesting that there is a midrashic approach, right, that about this fellow, the Makoshesh Eitzim, right, that he was something of had kind of sacrificed himself because he wanted to illustrate the notion of the consequence for sin, right? And the idea, again, if we take that approach, right, that when they say he died in his sin, that itself is a little bit of an argument. Our Father, even though he died in his sin was done, right, with good intentions, right? And it's designed as a defense of him. And what's interesting, right, is that would work very nicely, right? They say our father died Bamidbar, right, in the wilderness. The story of the Makoshesh Eitzim begins, Vayu b'nei Yisrael Bamidbar. The Jewish people were in the wilderness, right? So again, it's giving us almost like a possible cross-reference, right? If we want to identify the sin, right? He says our father died in the Midbar. Who specifically is identified as dying in the Midbar? That would be the Makoshesh Eitzim. So that's possibility number one. Possibility number two, right, is a suggestion, and the Maral talks about this idea as well. That what we are dealing with is that he was one of the Ma'apilim. Right, so who are the Ma'apilim? So again, we have to refer back to Parsha Shlach. So if you remember, after the decree that the Jews would not be allowed to go into Eretz Yisrael in that generation, right? There's a group of Jews who want a second chance. They say, no, we're going to go, right? Everything we said at Eretz Yisrael before, we're now willing to go and accept, and we are going to go and fight, right? And then they somewhat disastrously, right, go up. Moshe warns them it's not going to work for you, right? Ein Hashem b'kir bechem, right? Hashem is not in your midst, right? But they don't listen. They go ahead and they fight, and they are vanquished. Now, what's interesting, if we're going to take this approach, is again that we can read this as that the Bnei Slavchad are arguing that this is actually a feather in their cap, as it were. Why? Right? Because the Ma'apilim, even though, again, the Ma'apilim sinned, right, they weren't doing the correct thing, right? What they were exhibiting is this trait, which we see certainly in the Bnei Slavchad, right? This idea of chibas haaretz, right? And there's this idea of loving, of having a desire for Eretz Yisrael, right? And that basically, right, yes, our father died in his sin, right? But they really, in certain ways, are the tikkun, right? Are the repair for the sin of the Ma'apilim. The Ma'apilim were people who their love for Eretz Yisrael, right, won out over the direct instructions of Moshe Rabbeinu. The Bnei Tzlavchad, on the one hand, right, are challenging the status quo. On the same time, right, they're giving the authority back to Moshe Rabbeinu. They say we are consumed with love of Eretz Yisrael, just like our father was. Right, we want to be able to perpetuate his name and his love. Right, that was misguided in its form in terms of the Ma'apilim, but we're putting it back to Moshe. Right, we're saying, Moshe, you tell us what the will of God is in this question, right? So in that sense, right, that the sin again becomes a merit of sorts. The last approach is a medrash found in the Sifrei, in the Sifrei Zuta actually, that wants to put Tzlavchad's death, right, as something that took place imminently before the events of the Parsha. In other words, and I think perhaps part of the motivation for that, right, is the question of if we are going to assume, right, like the Makoshesh Eitzim or the Ma'apilim, or even that he died at some point in the wilderness, right, for some other reason, right? It begs the question, why is it taken till now for the Bnei Tzlavchad to make their case? In other words, right, so one possibility is just say, okay, that now is the time, right, when they are about to enter into Eretz Yisrael, right, the final battles are taking place, they're counting up the families, Hashem gives the instructions, right, so now they present kind of what had been almost like a cold case, right, something that had been irrelevant for a long period of time. But the Sifrei Zuta wants to say no. If you remember, right, that there had been this war against the Canaanim, right, against the Canaanites, right, it's referred to in last week's Parsha, in Parshas Chukas. And he wants to say, right, that it makes sense to put the death of Tzlavchad, right, of the father of these women, right, as something that had recently happened, right? And again, it changes a little bit the contours of how we understand the story, right? Are they recounting something, a trauma deep in their past that happened a long time beforehand, right? Like the Makoshesh Eitzim, like the Ma'apilim, or so forth. Or no, this is something new, right? Their father had recently died, right? And that they are now, right, against the backdrop of about the end of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, they are trying to play this out. So again, just to quickly review, we looked at two fundamental approaches to the statement of the Bnei Tzlavchad. Their father did not die as part of the punishment of Korach. Right. One is, right, to say that there is something really fundamentally worse about Korach's rebellion than any of the other sins in the wilderness. Right, and the Ramban's kind of startling take that they were concerned, and perhaps this is really a misperception on their part, that Moshe took Adas Korach more personally, right? That he had more skin in the game involved in that. Or to say that Korach sin, right, typifies a certain kind of sin that took place in the wilderness. It's not exclusive to Adas Korach, right? This is the words of Rashi based on the Sifrei, right? But any Korach-like sin. In other words, he died as a consequence of a garden variety violation, right? Not one of these massive kinds of rebellion, right? And basically what they're saying is, so therefore, like he doesn't deserve to disappear, right? And his chelek, his portion of Eretz Yisrael should continue in his family. Then we looked at a number of speculations as to what his sin might mean. And again, the approach of Rabbi Akiva, that this specifically is the story of the wood gatherer, the Makoshesh Eitzim, the suggestion that he was one of the Ma'apilim, right? One of those people who had an albeit misguided passion for Eretz Yisrael, right? That ends in tragedy in the aftermath of the sin of the spies, right? But that value, right, and now kind of filtered through a regard for going back to Moshe Rabbeinu and getting that divine insight, right, kind of elevating that. And then the approach of the Sifrei Zuta that says maybe the best thing to do is to look at what were recent things that had transpired, right, and to identify his death as something that had happened temporally, right, close by to the events described in our Parsha. Good Shabbos and an easy fast to all.